Hello, my name is Audrey. And on the day I thought I'd finally have my happily ever after, my own sister stood up in the middle of my wedding and screamed she was pregnant with my husband's child, and that I already knew. The church went silent, 200 eyes turning on me like I was the villain. But what hurt worse than her scream were the years of being erased, dismissed, compared, and pushed aside. Was I really the fool they all believed? Or was I the one holding every secret that could burn them all? Charleston in the spring has a way of dressing itself up for celebrations. The moss hanging from the oaks seemed heavier that year, like an old curtain drawn low across the sky. Churches lined the narrow streets, their bells steady reminders that traditions here were not to be toyed with. Families, especially ours, carried reputations like heirlooms, polished for display, but often chipped on the inside. I was 32, the youngest daughter, the one most people still referred to as the baby. My parents adored my older sister, Ophelie, with an intensity that left little room for me to shine. She was the strong one, the accomplished one. I was expected to follow her lead quietly, thankful for the shadow she cast. Planning my wedding should have shifted that balance, but in Charleston, old family stories cling stubbornly. A daughter's wedding wasn't just her day, it was the community's theater, the family's pride, and in my case, the perfect stage for cracks to show. Money had already been stretched. Weddings here are no small feat, and every vendor seemed to carry a silent tax for prestige. I was keenly aware of each dollar leaving my account, though my parents pretended finances weren't pressing. That was Charleston respectability at play. You don't admit strain, you just smile tighter. It was under this polite pressure that the first cracks began to surface. They didn't roar in like thunder. They slipped in, quiet, like hairline fractures in glass. It happened during a casual family dinner on a Thursday evening. The kitchen smelled of collards and cornbread, my mother humming as she moved pots around, while my father sipped sweet tea in his favorite chair. Damien, my fiancé, sat at the table beside Ophelie. The sight wasn't unusual. Ophelie had always been in the middle of our lives, but the way they leaned toward each other set something in my chest on edge. They laughed at something I hadn't heard. Ophelie touched his arm briefly as she teased. Remember that weekend in Asheville, when we almost missed the ferry because you insisted on stopping for pie? Damien chuckled, his face lighting up with recognition. How could I forget? That was the best apple pie I ever had. I froze. I had never been on a ferry with Damien in Asheville. That memory wasn't mine. I forced a smile, pushing food around my plate. Funny, I don't recall that trip. Ophelie's eyes met mine for a split second, cool and unbothered. Oh, right, she said smoothly. It must have been before you two met. Damien and I have been friends for ages, you know. The table carried on, the conversation sliding into stories of work and neighbors, but my ears buzzed. I wanted to shake it off, to tell myself I was imagining something that wasn't there. Yet the old saying echoed in my mind. Trust is like glass. Once cracked, it never looks the same again. That night I lay awake longer than usual, replaying that moment. And the laughter between them, the way they shared something I wasn't part of. I told myself not to overreact, that families are complicated and memories overlap. Still, I couldn't help wondering if what I saw was just friendship, or the edge of something else I didn't want to name. Weeks later, during a pre-wedding photo session, another quiet blow landed. My parents had insisted on a family shoot, to mark the start of something big. We gathered at a park downtown, the church spires rising behind us. The air was thick with jasmine, and I tried to hold on to the sweetness, reminding myself this was supposed to be my time. The photographer, a young man Ophelie recommended, was enthusiastic but oddly fixated on her. Let's get one more with Ophelie in front. She has the best smile, he said, gesturing with his camera. I laughed awkwardly, stepping aside as he rearranged us. Ophelie glided into the center, my mother adjusting her scarf, my father nodding in approval. Damien stood on her other side, smiling easily as though nothing were out of place. In the next set of shots, I was literally on the edge, my face partly turned, blurred by a shaft of light cutting across the lens. Each click of the camera shutter felt like a quiet erasure, as if I was being pushed out of my own story frame by frame. I tried to joke, "Hey, don't forget who's the bride here." The photographer chuckled, not meeting my eyes. Of course, just capturing the energy of the moment." But the energy, it seemed, belonged to Ophelie. As the session went on, I felt myself shrink, pressed against the edges of the picture. It reminded me of years of being the afterthought, the one whose science fair ribbons were displayed on a side table while Ophelie's trophies had their own shelf. When we finally wrapped up, I caught a glimpse of the photos on his screen. There she was, radiant and centered, while I was often turned at an angle, like a guest caught walking into someone else's celebration. I smiled tightly, thanking him for his work. Inside, my chest burned. Sometimes, I thought bitterly, it feels like I'm just a guest at my own wedding. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window, the humid Charleston air sticking to my skin. I thought back on those patterns, the countless times I had been edged out, silenced by politeness, told to let things go. But I also remembered my grandmother's voice, calm and steady. "Don't raise your voice. Improve your argument." She was a woman who had lived through decades of being underestimated, who knew the power of holding your ground without flailing. I realized then that the moments with Damien and Ophelie, the photographer's choices, my parents' approval of her over me, none of it was isolated. These weren't accidents. They were threads in a larger pattern, woven too tightly to ignore. I didn't lash out. I didn't accuse. I simply tucked the images and words away, storing them like stones in my pocket. Heavy, yes, but ready to be used if needed. Looking out at the quiet street, I whispered to myself, "They think I'll stay quiet. They don't see me sharpening in silence." I didn't know it yet, but being hidden in those photos was just the first step in being erased from my own wedding. The weeks leading up to the wedding blurred into a cycle of lists, phone calls, and mounting bills. Every morning began with a stack of reminders, flowers to confirm, the caterer's menu to finalize, invoices that seemed to grow longer by the day. Weddings in Charleston weren't just family affairs, they were productions, and everyone in the community seemed to have a ticket. The pressure to host something memorable weighed heavily, though I kept my smile fixed for relatives and vendors alike. Damien grew more distant during this period. He was often at the office late, or tied up with client meetings that bled into weekends. When I asked if he could help choose linens or taste cakes, his phone would buzz, and he'd wave me off with a half-hearted promise to check later. Ophelie, on the other hand, was always available. She inserted herself into planning decisions, volunteering to attend vendor meetings when Damien couldn't. She seemed to thrive on it, charming the florist, complimenting the photographer, and leaving me to wonder whether my own wedding had somehow shifted its center away from me. I tried to swallow the unease. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, steady and practical. "Pick your battles, child. Sometimes silence keeps the peace." So I ignored the tightening knot in my chest when I saw Ophelie's handwriting on notes for the rehearsal dinner, or when she corrected the guest list without asking me. I told myself that keeping harmony mattered more than pointing out every intrusion. Still, a quiet voice inside whispered that harmony built on cracks couldn't last. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a pile of receipts and statements. My habit of checking every detail had only intensified with wedding expenses spiraling. As I scrolled through the credit card transactions, several stood out. Charges from a boutique cafe across town, one I'd never visited. Small amounts but frequent, every Tuesday afternoon for 3 weeks. Then, a hotel charge, not extravagant but suspiciously placed on a night Damien claimed to be working late downtown. When I asked him about it later, I tried to keep my tone light, almost teasing. Did you develop a new love for espresso on the other side of town? He glanced up from his phone, expression smooth. Oh, that. Client meetings. You know how it is. That hotel has a quiet lobby, perfect for working undisturbed. I smiled faintly, but my mind held on to the unease. Work must be keeping you busy, I said, careful not to press. He leaned over, kissed my temple, and muttered, It'll settle down soon, don't worry. But worry clung like humidity in the Charleston air. Trust, once stretched, doesn't snap right away. It thins like an old rope, fraying quietly until one day it breaks. The following week, during a casual lunch with Ophelie, the puzzle pieces shifted into place. She stirred her iced tea and laughed about a cafe she had just discovered. Her words caught me. They make the best chai latte in town. I stop there every Tuesday after work. You'd love it. My fork froze mid-air. The same cafe. The same Tuesdays. She spoke without hesitation, as if the detail carried no weight, but my mind connected it instantly. I didn't confront her. I smiled, nodded, and changed the subject. Inside, my thoughts churned. The charges, Damien's explanation, Ophelie's casual mention. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a map, drawn in faint lines only I seemed willing to read. A week later, a package arrived at the house. I recognized the handwriting on the label. It belonged to an older cousin from Virginia, someone I hadn't seen in years. Excited, I called Damien into the living room, and we opened it together. Inside was a delicate set of wine glasses, etched with vines curling up the stem. But it wasn't the gift that made my stomach twist. And it was the card. To Damien and Ophelie, best wishes for a long and happy life together. For a moment, silence filled the room. Damien laughed awkwardly, lifting the glasses from the box. Clearly a mistake, he said quickly. My mother, who had come by to drop off more family photos for the slideshow, waved it off with a chuckle. It's just a typo, honey. Don't make it bigger than it is. But my eyes caught Ophelie's expression. She was leaning against the doorway, arms folded, lips curved in the faintest smirk. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The card said enough. I forced myself to breathe steadily, setting the card back into the box. Of course, I said softly. A simple mix-up. But my chest burned. Americans have a saying, once is a mistake, twice is a pattern. The cafe, the hotel, now the card addressed to my sister. It no longer felt like random slights or innocent oversights. It felt deliberate, like the edges of my story were being rewritten around me. The humiliation was small but sharp, like a paper cut across tender skin. To everyone else, it looked like nothing, an error, a laughable slip, but to me, it was another quiet erasure. That night, sitting alone by the window, I admitted to myself how trapped I felt between two choices: speak up and risk being dismissed as paranoid, or stay silent and let the cracks widen. I thought again of my grandmother's words. Don't let small cracks destroy your foundation, but don't ignore when the whole wall starts shifting. I decided then I couldn't keep pretending. I would pay attention, quietly but carefully. Every odd expense, every slip of the tongue, every smirk or laugh that didn't fit. I would notice, and I would remember. I told myself it was just a typo, just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. These were no longer cracks. They were warning signs. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration, one of those evenings that marked the turning point before vows were spoken and rings exchanged. My parents had gone all out, renting the ballroom at a local inn with exposed brick walls, chandeliers that cast a warm glow, and long tables draped in white cloth. Platters of shrimp and grits, fried green tomatoes, and roasted chicken filled the air with familiar southern scents. From the outside, it looked perfect, a night for family, laughter, and blessings. Inside me, though, I carried a quiet nervousness. Every seat around those tables represented an opinion, every smile a judgment waiting to be formed. In Charleston, rehearsal dinners weren't just practice, they were stage performances where families displayed their unity to the world. For me, the weight was heavier because I was the youngest, the one still treated like a child. I smiled, greeted distant cousins I hadn't seen in years, and helped the servers set pitchers of iced tea on every table. I told myself, keep calm. Tonight is about showing gratitude, not about settling scores. But beneath that resolve, I hoped for something simple. For once, to feel like this was truly my night. The toasts began after dessert. Aunts spoke warmly about family traditions. Damien's uncle told a light-hearted story from his childhood, and I started to relax. Then Ophelie rose, microphone in hand, her dress shimmering under the lights, as if she were the bride. "Where do I begin?" she started, smiling out at the guests. "My little sister has always been right behind me, whether it was learning to ride a bike, getting into college, or, well, let's just say she's still learning how to grow up." Laughter scattered around the room, some light, some uneasy. My stomach tightened. She wasn't finished. "Remember that boyfriend from college?" she continued, tilting her head toward me. "The one who thought he wanted forever but realized he needed someone more mature?" She chuckled, drawing another ripple of laughter. Though a few relatives exchanged awkward glances, I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. She was dragging out an old wound, one I had long since buried, here in front of both families. I caught my father's frown, my mother's stiff smile, and Damien's uncomfortable shift in his chair. Still, no one stopped her. "Family," she concluded sweetly, "is about sticking together, even when someone stumbles, and I'm proud to see Audrey finally finding her way." The applause was hesitant, scattered. I sat frozen, my fingers gripping the napkin in my lap so tightly it nearly tore. Inside, words pounded in my chest, but none escaped my lips. Humiliation was a taste I knew too well. A thought struck me, sharp as glass. Family is supposed to be your safe place. If it isn't, it becomes the sharpest knife. As the clapping faded, my mother leaned toward me, her voice soft, almost affectionate. "Ophelie has always been so strong," she said, looking at me with what she believed was encouragement. "I hope you can learn from her example as a wife." Her words cut more deeply than my sister's public jabs. They weren't loud, they weren't cruel in tone, but they carried decades of comparison. I had been hearing variations of that line since childhood. How I should follow Ophelie's lead, how I was still the baby, how strength seemed to skip me. I forced a smile, nodding politely as relatives around us nodded too, murmuring agreement. "Yes, Ophelie is strong," one aunt said. "Such a role model." My chest burned, but I kept my lips pressed into that practiced smile. Inside, I thought, it wasn't the words tonight that hurt most. It was the history behind them. Years of being placed in her shadow, years of never quite measuring up in their eyes. Tonight, that history replayed itself under the warm glow of chandeliers, disguised as love. The pain wasn't loud, it was layered, quiet, and heavy, like stones stacked one on top of another. Small, offhand remarks often leave the deepest scars. I didn't let my face betray the storm inside. I didn't stand up or lash out. Instead, I let silence cover me like a cloak. But inside that silence, I made a vow. I told myself, I won't be erased this time. Respect isn't demanded by shouting. It's earned by never letting them take your dignity. So I sat, letting them think I was still the compliant younger sister, still the one who would accept the digs and comparisons without reply. But in my mind, I was already collecting these moments, storing them as fuel. Every laugh at my expense, every nod toward Ophelie's strength over mine, they weren't breaking me, they were sharpening me. I sipped my water, steadying my breath, and watched the room through narrowed eyes. They thought I was small, silent, and safe. They had no idea silence can turn into steel when wielded with patience. They thought I was still the little sister who would stay quiet, but they had no idea I was already learning how to sharpen silence into a weapon. That night, after the rehearsal dinner, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. The house was still, but inside me, the echoes of the evening kept bouncing around like they refused to die down. My mother's words, meant to sound kind, cut deeper than any of Ophelie's sharp jokes. Ophelie has always been so strong. I hope Audrey can learn from her example as a wife. I had smiled then, for the crowd, but lying alone in bed, the smile felt like a mask I could no longer bear. Outside, Charleston's night wrapped itself around the house, thick air heavy with the scent of wisteria, cicadas droning, the kind of silence that presses instead of soothes. Damien came in late, loosening his tie, telling me he had work to catch up on. "I'll be in the study," he said, brushing my cheek with a quick kiss before leaving. His casual tone should have reassured me, but instead, it pressed on the sore spot inside me. He had used that line too often, and lately, work seemed to always pull him further away from me. I rolled onto my side, eyes half closed, pretending to drift off, but my body was alert, every nerve listening. Something in me refused to let it go, and I decided I would wait. It didn't take long before I heard his voice, muffled through the study door. At first I thought he was on a call with a client, his tone hushed and deliberate. But then I caught something different, soft, almost playful inflections. I crept closer, barefoot, careful not to let the wood floor creak. Pressing against the wall, I could make out fragments. Damien's voice was lower than usual, gentle, in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in weeks. "You know we can't slip up now," he whispered. "She can't know. Not yet." And then, faint but distinct, laughter. Ophelie's laugh. I would recognize it anywhere. That lilting sound that had always drawn attention, now filtering through a line that should never have connected us in this way. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain they would hear it through the walls. I gripped the edge of the hallway table just to steady myself. It wasn't a client. It wasn't business. It was her. I closed my eyes, the words circling in my head like a wasp. She can't know. I felt cold seep into me, a confirmation of what my instincts had whispered for weeks. I didn't burst in, didn't confront him. Not yet. I knew if I did, he'd brush me off, call me paranoid, tell me I was imagining things. I could already hear him say, "You always overthink, Audrey." Instead, I backed away, my breaths shallow, and whispered to myself a phrase my father used when something seemed too perfect. If something smells off, it usually is. Tonight, everything reeked of betrayal. Trying to calm my shaking hands, I went into the guest room where boxes of stationery were stacked. I told myself I needed distraction, something to keep from falling apart right there in the hallway. I pulled open a box, sorting through envelopes, RSVP cards, and sample invitations we'd collected over months of planning. As I shuffled through, something slipped out. A card, worn along the edges, clearly older than the rest. Curious, I opened it. My breath caught. It wasn't addressed to me. The front bore a simple gold border, but inside, in Damien's handwriting, were the words, "To Ophelie, my always." You'll always be my first choice. The date scrawled in the corner froze me. It was from 2 years before he proposed to me. I sank into the chair, the card trembling in my hand. A memory surfaced. Ophalie once laughing with a cousin saying, "I almost married a banker once. Can you imagine?" At the time, I had brushed it off as one of her exaggerated jokes. Now it twisted into something else, undeniable and cruel. The room felt smaller, the air heavy. Tears pricked at my eyes, but none fell. Devastation warred with clarity. This wasn't just a recent slip. This wasn't temptation that came after we were engaged. This was a thread running back further, a betrayal long in the making. I pressed the card to my chest, the words echoing like poison. You'll always be my first choice. Love doesn't die suddenly. It rots quietly, hidden in corners, until the smell fills the room and you can't ignore it anymore. Tonight, I could smell it everywhere. I placed the card back into the box, sliding it beneath other papers as if burying it again. Not out of denial, but strategy. Storming into the study, waving it in Damien's face, would get me nothing. He would twist it, explain it away, and I would be painted as jealous or irrational. I knew better. Emotion alone wouldn't save me here. Proof would. I sat in the stillness, recalling my grandmother's firm words. Don't swing wild, aim straight, and wait for your shot. She had been through battles of her own and knew the cost of showing your hand too soon. I breathed deeply, letting the fury settle into something colder, sharper. If this was the truth, that Damien and Ophalie's betrayal wasn't a mistake but a plan, then I would not be their casualty. That night I realized the betrayal wasn't a mistake, it was a plan. And I wasn't about to let them write me out of my own story. After that night of overheard whispers and the card that revealed more than I was ready to face, something in me shifted. I lay in bed for hours, staring into the dark, and realized I couldn't let myself be consumed by fury. Rage might have satisfied me for a moment, but it wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed strategy. A storm isn't stopped by yelling at the clouds. You prepare, you board the windows, and you wait. So that's what I did. The next morning, I got up, made coffee, and went through the motions of my day. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, my mind had changed gears. Every glance between Damien and Ophalie, every excuse he gave about late meetings, every smile she offered at my expense, I noted it, tucked it away like beads on a string. I wouldn't confront them without proof. My grandmother's wisdom hummed inside me. Accusations without evidence would backfire. So I straightened my back, hid the cracks, and began to plan quietly. I reached out to Leora, my cousin, one of the few people I trusted without question. She had always been sharp, the kind who could read a room in a single glance. I asked her for coffee downtown and told her just enough for her to know I needed help. "Don't shout, Audrey," she said, her voice low but firm as she stirred sugar into her cup. "You don't need to shout to be heard. Evidence speaks louder." She slipped me a card, the name of a private investigator she knew through her work. Discreet, professional, trust him. That night, when Damien said he was going to catch up on reports, I smiled sweetly and told him not to stay up too late. As soon as he left the room, I dialed the number on the card. The man answered in a calm, steady voice, and I explained my situation. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, only said, "We'll document everything, photos, receipts, recordings. You'll know the truth." And so it began. My days looked the same to everyone else. Calls to vendors, choosing centerpieces, smiling at my mother's endless opinions, but underneath, I was cataloging red flags. When Damien's phone lit up with texts at midnight and he angled the screen away, I remembered. When Ophalie's perfume lingered faintly on his jacket, I remembered. I copied bank statements quietly, slipping them back before he noticed. I wrote down the times he claimed to be stuck in traffic and matched them against receipts. Nobody suspected a thing. If anything, they thought I was distracted with flower arrangements and invitations. And I let them believe that. Because the truth was, I was no longer the victim trailing behind events. I was the one taking control, quietly, deliberately. 2 weeks before the wedding, I went to my final dress fitting at a boutique downtown. The room was lined with mirrors, soft lighting casting a glow on the gowns. For a moment, I let myself breathe in the fantasy of it. White lace, pearl buttons, the way the fabric whispered against the floor. But when the seamstress lifted the gown to adjust the hem, my heart sank. There was a small tear along the seam, not large enough to ruin the dress, but enough to make me pause. The fabric was snagged in a way that didn't look like accident. Before I could say anything, Ophelie's voice floated in from behind me. "Oh no, is it torn?" She stepped forward, her hands brushing the fabric as though to help. For a moment, I caught it, the faintest smirk flickering across her lips before she masked it with concern. "Don't worry, little sis," she said lightly, smoothing the dress. "It's barely noticeable. No one will see." I stood there, silent, my reflection fractured in the mirrors around me. To anyone else, it was a small thing, a mishap easily explained. But I knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was sabotage, subtle and cruel, meant to shake me before the biggest day of my life. Inside, I burned. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of reaction. I straightened my shoulders, looked at myself in the mirror, and thought, if they wanted me broken, they should have picked a weaker woman. A dress is only fabric. Even if it tears, I can still wear it proudly. Strength isn't in appearances. It's in refusing to let others decide your worth. As I left the boutique, dress packed carefully in a garment bag, the sun had begun to dip low, painting Charleston in hues of gold and amber. The city buzzed as usual, but inside me a different current was running. Every attempt they made to erase me, every effort to humiliate me, only sharpened my focus. Walking back to my car, I remembered a line from Eleanor Roosevelt I had once written down in a notebook. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." For years, I had given that consent without realizing it, bowing my head, letting their words sting but never strike back. Not anymore. I placed the dress gently in the back seat, closed the door, and slid behind the wheel. As I drove home, my grip on the steering wheel tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. They thought a torn dress would unravel me. They didn't know I was already weaving a net around them. The final rehearsal dinner before the wedding was dressed up like a small-town gala. The inn's banquet hall glowed under strings of lights, with long wooden tables lined in linen and glassware polished until it sparkled. Fried chicken, collard greens, and biscuits filled the air with familiar comfort. But beneath the hum of chatter and clinking cutlery, my stomach turned. This wasn't just a meal. It was a performance. In Charleston, rehearsals weren't private gatherings. They were public stages where families displayed unity, dignity, and tradition. Every eye in that hall was watching, weighing not only Damien and me, but the whole picture of our families. I smoothed the skirt of my dress and walked in with a smile pasted carefully in place. My mind whispered, in the South, weddings are less about two people and more about the stage for everyone watching. I braced myself, knowing that public settings always gave Ophelie her sharpest edge. When I entered the dining room, I looked toward the head table where my place had been reserved, right beside my parents, a small acknowledgement of my role as the bride. But my smile froze. My chair was already taken. Ophelie sat there, laughing, chatting with our father, looking as though the seat had always been hers. My name card had been shifted backward, tucked discreetly onto the table one row behind. I paused, the weight of the room pressing on me. Conversations carried on. No one seemed to notice. My mother gave me a quick wave, motioning for me to sit where the new card rested. I stepped forward, quiet but steady, slipping into the lower seat without protest. As I pulled out the chair, a cousin leaned toward another guest and said with a laugh, "Well, Ophelie does look more like the leading lady, doesn't she?" The words struck like a slap. I kept my head high, folded my napkin neatly, and poured myself water. Inside, bitterness surged. Respect isn't always denied by force. Sometimes it's stolen in silence. I didn't let it show. If they expected me to crumble, they would see only calm. But as I chewed politely, every bite felt like swallowing ash. Dinner moved along, plates cleared, new dishes set down. Conversations grew louder, laughter flowing freely. Just as I began to steady my breathing, another arrow flew. A distant aunt, her pearls gleaming under the lights, leaned close to me. "Your sister has always been the star," she said warmly, almost as if it were a compliment. "You must be proud of her." Before I could respond, another relative across the table chimed in with a chuckle. "At least you finally get your turn, even if you're the understudy." Laughter rippled around the table. Some covered their mouths in awkwardness, others didn't bother. I swallowed hard, my face fixed in a small smile. Inside, I felt the heat creep up my neck, humiliation searing through me. I lifted my glass of water, sipped slowly, and let the sting settle like a coal in my chest. Outwardly, I was unbothered. Inwardly, I whispered Maya Angelou's words I had read years ago. "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them." I wouldn't let them reduce me. Not tonight, not ever again. Still, the ache of being erased, diminished, cut down by those who should have stood beside me, pressed harder. I thought of all the times silence had been my survival, and all the times it had cost me. But this time, the silence wasn't weakness, it was a seed. Soon, I knew, actions would speak for me in ways words never could. By the time dessert was served, I had composed myself completely. Around me, laughter carried on, forks tapped against plates, and the night looked perfect to anyone outside. But inside me, something else had formed. These small humiliations, the subtle erasures, would have broken me years ago. They would have left me crying quietly in my room, blaming myself. Not anymore. Now, each sting was another arrow in my quiver, another weapon I would use when the moment was right. I imagined them thinking they were cutting me down. What they didn't realize was that they were sharpening my blade for me. I smiled, polite, serene. Silence doesn't mean surrender. It means waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The church bells rang in steady tones as guests settled into the wooden pews, their voices blending into a low murmur. Stained glass windows cast colored light over the aisle, patterns of red and gold moving across my dress as I stood waiting with my father at the back. For years, I had pictured this walk. As a little girl, I imagined lace and flowers, the kind of moment fairy tales insist is the beginning of happily ever after. Yet as I breathed in the scent of lilies now, that dream felt far away, blurred by doubt that had been gathering like storm clouds. Damien waited at the altar, shifting from foot to foot, his jaw tight. I noticed the way he avoided looking directly at me, his eyes darting instead toward the bridesmaids lined near the pulpit. Ophelie stood among them, her chin lifted slightly higher than the others, her smile stretched thin. My heart tightened. Weddings in the South weren't only vows. They were public trials. Every mistake, every crack in the family veneer would echo through generations. Humiliation here meant shame, not just for me, but for every person carrying my last name. Still, I stepped forward when the music began, holding my father's arm as the congregation turned to watch. The hush in the air was heavy, every movement magnified. I forced myself to breathe, to place one foot in front of the other, even as dread curled inside me. The pastor began, voice steady, leading us through the solemn ritual. I heard him ask Damien if he would take me as his wife. Damien's voice was faint, almost cracking as he whispered, "I do." Then the pastor turned to me. "And do you, Audrey?" The words were cut off by a sharp cry. "Stop this wedding!" The voice rang out so loudly it seemed to shake the stained glass. Every head turned. Gasps rippled through the pews like a wave. My body froze as Ophelie stepped forward, her eyes burning with a feverish gleam. "I'm pregnant with Damien's child!" The room erupted. Whispers, shocked exclamations, someone muttering, "Dear Lord," loud enough to carry. My mother grabbed my father's hand, his face turning ashen. I could hear a cousin hiss to another, "Is she serious?" I stood rooted, the bouquet trembling in my hands. Sound seemed muffled, as though cotton filled my ears. My heartbeat thundered, drowning everything else out. I turned toward Damien. His face had gone pale, eyes fixed on the floor, lips pressed shut. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look at me. Ophelie's voice rang again, triumphant, savoring the spectacle. "Everyone needs to know the truth. You all deserve to know." Inside me, a voice whispered, "Some betrayals don't whisper. They scream so the whole world hears." I fought the urge to collapse, to let the ground take me. Instead, I forced myself to scan the room, to take in the faces, the wide eyes, the murmurs, the shame bleeding from my parents' expressions. Ophelie stood taller, as if she had won, but she wasn't finished. Her tone sharpened, dripping with venom. "And Audrey knew it all along. She tried to hide it from you." The congregation erupted again, this time with sharper edges. "She knew? Did she really?" Voices hissed. The whispers pierced like knives. My father turned his gaze on me, searching my face with disbelief. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. The betrayal deepened, no longer just about a fiancé and a sister. It was my very credibility, my truth, ripped apart in front of those I loved. They weren't just breaking trust, they were painting me a liar. I felt the sting of every eye on me, the weight of judgment pressing down. Yet even then, a stubborn spark lit inside. They wanted me small, they wanted me broken. Instead, I lifted my chin, forcing my hands steady. I thought to myself, "You may try to bury me in shame, but I will not bow." Ophelie sneered, feeding off the silence. "She let you all think this was real when she knew the whole time." Damien stood still, useless, cowardly, his silence condemning us both. But I would not give them the satisfaction of tears. I stood taller. "They wanted me small," I told myself again, steadying my breathing. "I choose to stand taller." The church was chaos. Gasps, murmurs, relatives shifting uncomfortably, neighbors exchanging looks. But in that storm, I became still. I remembered my grandmother's words. Silence is sometimes the loudest truth. So I stayed silent. My stillness screamed louder than Ophelie's accusations. Let her dig. Let her reveal everything in her need for attention. I knew then I wouldn't fight her here, not yet. Patience would be my weapon. They thought they had buried me with that scream. What they didn't know was that I was already holding the shovel. For a moment after Ophelie's scream, the church froze. Her words still echoed off the stone walls, pregnant with Damien's child. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the outburst itself. Guests shifted in their pews, whispering behind hands, their eyes darting between me and my sister. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. Damien stood rigid at the altar, sweat gathering on his forehead. He didn't meet my gaze. Instead, he stared at the floor, shoulders tight. lips pressed into a thin line. I held my bouquet steady and chose stillness. I didn't collapse. I didn't argue. Inside, my heart raced, but my grandmother's wisdom rang clear. Sometimes silence is the only weapon that cuts clean. So I stood quietly, letting the silence sharpen around me. Ophelie mistook my quiet for surrender. Her chin lifted, her voice swelling with boldness. "She's been pretending this whole time," she said, her words slicing through the sanctuary. Audrey has been covering for him, playing the perfect fiancée while hiding what she knew. The congregation stirred. People whispered, "Did she know? Could it be true?" The weight of their doubt pressed against me. But I stayed still, watching, listening. If I shouted back, I would lose. If I remained calm, she would keep talking. And the more she talked, the deeper she would dig herself. I noticed her contradictions immediately. She claimed Damien had stayed with her every Wednesday evening, yet he had told my parents he'd been out of town for work those nights. She insisted he had confessed to doubting the wedding months ago, but just last week he'd stood in front of my family proclaiming his love and excitement. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned, their eyes narrowing at her. The longer she spoke, the less believable she became. I thought to myself, let her talk, let her bury herself. "Damien told me he wished he'd chosen me from the start," she continued, voice rising. "And Audrey knew. She's always known." I could feel the tension building in the room. Relatives who had been silent began to murmur against her. My cousin whispered loudly, "She's contradicting herself." Another voice said, "Why would Audrey hide this?" And in that moment, I understood. Silence was my trap, and Ophelie had walked right into it. I turned slightly, my eyes on the small table by the altar where the projector remote rested. It was meant for the slideshow of Damien's and my photos, our vacations, family gatherings, memories built over 3 years. But I had replaced those images days ago with help from Leora, my cousin who had believed me when no one else would. I walked calmly to the table, each step deliberate. The room hushed again as I picked up the remote. For a second, I looked at Damien. He finally raised his head, panic flashing in his eyes. He knew. Without a word, I pressed the button. The screen above the altar flickered, then lit up. Instead of smiling engagement photos, the image of a hotel hallway appeared. A date and timestamp glowed in the corner. The footage showed Damien and Ophelie stepping out of a room together, laughing, holding hands. Gasps filled the sanctuary. Someone muttered, "Good Lord, it's true." Another voice cracked with anger. How could she do this to her own sister? The video continued. More scenes, more proof. Damien brushing Ophelie's cheek tenderly, Ophelie leaning against him, their closeness undeniable. Damien's face drained of color. His hands twitched at his sides as if he wanted to snatch the remote away, but knew he couldn't. Ophelie staggered, her confidence faltering. That's not what it looks like," she stammered, but the congregation was already murmuring angrily, the tide turning against her. I stood quietly, remote in hand, watching. Inside, my fury was steady, controlled. Outwardly, I was composed. They had tried to humiliate me with words. I had chosen evidence. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I let the images speak louder than any denial they could attempt. My father's eyes, once clouded with suspicion, now burned with fury at Damien. He gripped the pew so tightly his knuckles whitened. My mother, who had sat frozen in shame, now looked at me with tears welling, as if silently apologizing for doubting me. The same relatives who had whispered that I might have known were now whispering in my defense. She was telling the truth. She stayed quiet while they lied. I kept my expression calm, though inside a part of me wanted to collapse from the weight of vindication. Truth has a way of sounding louder than lies, even when spoken softly. But I knew this was only the first strike. Evidence had shifted the room, but there was more to come. They thought their scream would define my wedding. But I had prepared for this moment, and I was just getting started. The projector screen faded to black, leaving the church in stunned silence. Whispers rustled like wind through tall grass, growing louder as people tried to make sense of what they had just seen. Some looked at me with pity, their eyes soft and uncertain, while others glared openly at Damien and Ophelie, their faces twisted in disgust. I didn't move. My bouquet rested calmly in my hands as if it had never trembled. The silence weighed heavily, and I let it. I wanted every person in that room to feel the difference between their noise and my stillness. Truth doesn't need a scream. It only needs a moment to breathe. Damien shifted at the altar, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. Ophelie crossed her arms, her smirk gone, her mouth tightening as though she were chewing bitterness. The murmurs were turning into a tide, and I knew it was time for the next wave. I stepped forward, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and held up a cream-colored envelope. "There's something else," I said, my voice clear. The room quieted. "This is a preliminary DNA report regarding the pregnancy my sister claims ties her to my fiancé." Gasps rippled instantly, some leaning forward, others clasping hands over their mouths. Ophelie's face drained of color. I unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately. The results show that Damien is not confirmed as the father. In fact, the probability is too low. The results indicate there may be another possible father, or fathers. The church broke into chaos. "She doesn't even know who the father is?" someone whispered loudly. Another voice, sharper, snapped, "What kind of circus is this?" My father, his face flushed with fury, slammed his hand on the pew. "You dragged us all here for this. You humiliated your sister and disgraced this family for a child you can't even name the father of?" Ophelie sputtered, "That test, it's not right, it's incomplete." But her words drowned beneath the storm of whispers and outrage. Neighbors who had once admired her whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Relatives avoided looking at her entirely. Inside, I felt the coil of anger inside me unwind, just slightly. They wanted me humiliated. Instead, they became the clowns. Charleston families knew the weight of paternity scandals. It wasn't just gossip, it was legacy, inheritance, the very question of who belonged and who didn't. And Ophelie had just lost every ounce of footing she thought she had. I let the tension hang before moving to the next blow. I gestured toward the projector again, and the technician hesitated, eyes flicking nervously to me. "Play the second file," I said firmly. The speakers crackled, and then Ophelie's voice filled the sanctuary. Her tone was sharp, mocking, dripping with arrogance. "She's too naive to ever see it coming," the recording played. "Audrey always believes the best in people. That's what makes this so easy." Gasps broke out. My aunt clutched her chest. The recording continued. Ophelie laughed, a cruel sound even more cutting than her words. "He told me he wished he had proposed to me instead. Poor Audrey has no idea how little she means to him." The murmurs turned to open outrage. "Shameful," someone hissed. Another muttered, "How could she say that about her own sister?" Damien stepped forward, his voice breaking. This is out of context." But before he could finish, the recording played on, cutting him off with brutal clarity. "We'll take her for everything she's worth. She'll be left with nothing but the dress she bought for herself." Ophelie's voice, once so polished, condemned her far more effectively than anything I could have said. I stood silently, eyes fixed on the congregation. Give a liar enough rope, and they'll hang themselves. The disgust in the room grew palpable, Guests rose to their feet, some shaking their heads, others whispering harshly. A few even left the sanctuary altogether, unwilling to sit in the same room with them any longer. Damien's lips moved, but no sound came out. His face sagged with the realization that nothing he could say would save him now. Ophelie clutched the side of the pew, her hand trembling, her face blotched with humiliation. The atmosphere shifted fully, the tide that had once pulled me under now carrying me above. Where there had been doubt, there was now solidarity. Where there had been pity, there was respect. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I remained calm, my voice steady as I finally spoke. I didn't win by shouting anyone down. I won by letting the truth be undeniable. Relatives who had doubted me earlier now glared openly at Ophelie and Damien. My father's eyes, once clouded with confusion, now burned with betrayal at them, not at me. The church felt heavier, but clearer, like a storm that had finally broken. And though I had revealed enough tonight to shake the walls, I knew this wasn't the final blow. There was still more to come, more masks to strip away. They had stripped me bare before my family. But now, it was my turn to strip them of every mask they wore. The church buzzed with whispers, a storm of gasps and mutters that hadn't stopped since the projector shut off. The DNA report and Ophelie's own words still hung in the air, sour and heavy. Some guests clutched their prayer books to their chests, others pointed openly at Damien and Ophelie. Damien lifted his head, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. These things can be taken out of context. His words faltered, brittle and hollow. The more he protested, the guiltier he looked. I stood in the middle of the altar, calm, my hands folded over my bouquet. The louder they protested, the guiltier they looked. Ophelie was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Her makeup streaked, her hands trembling, but her jaw still stubbornly clenched as if holding her pride together could stop the walls from caving in. Relatives looked back and forth, torn between disbelief and outrage. The weight of silence pressed down again, and I let it grow until all attention shifted back to me. I took a breath and held up a stack of papers, each page clipped neatly in a folder. My voice was steady. "This," I said, "is a record of a joint account, not mine and Damien's, Damien and Ophelie's." The gasp that followed was sharp, collective. I unfolded one of the statements and read aloud, my words echoing against the sanctuary walls. Over $15,000 transferred from the wedding account I funded into this shared account. Withdrawals made for hotels, jewelry, and personal expenses. A man in the third row muttered loudly, "So they stole from her to fund their lies?" Another voice, my uncle's, rang with disgust. "This isn't just betrayal. This is fraud." I looked at Damien. His lips parted, sputtering. I only moved the money temporarily. It wasn't—" The papers in my hands cut his lie short. Numbers and signatures spoke louder than excuses. I felt the sting in my chest ease, replaced by a sharper, cleaner strength. You can cheat my heart, but not my future. Guests shook their heads, some murmuring prayers under their breath. Older relatives leaned into each other, whispering about shame and disgrace. Charleston families understood money. The violation of trust in finances wasn't just personal, it was public. Damien hadn't only betrayed me, he had committed the cardinal sin of stealing from family for his deceit. I let the silence stretch again, each breath of outrage from the pews layering weight onto their shame. Then, I moved to the final blow. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out a folded letter from the pocket hidden in my bouquet. The paper was yellowed slightly at the edges, the ink pressed deep from a heavy hand. I held it up for all to see. "This," I said, "wasn't meant for me. It was meant for her." I opened it and read, my voice clear. To Ophalie, my always. You'll always be my first choice. The gasp this time wasn't sharp, it was guttural, raw, a sound of betrayal that shook the walls. Ophalie staggered forward, her hands outstretched, as if she could snatch the letter from the air. "You had no right!" she screamed, her voice shrill, cracking with panic. "You went through my things!" But no one defended her. The congregation's eyes were hard now, the tide fully turned. Damien hung his head, his shoulders slumped as if crushed under the weight of truth. No denial came, no excuses, only silence heavier than words. I lowered the paper slowly. They wanted me erased. Instead, they wrote their own confession. The room erupted, not with applause, not with celebration, but with chaos. Relatives rose to their feet, some shouting, others crying, many turning their anger directly on Damien and Ophalie. My parents stood, fury written on their faces. My father's voice was thunder. "You shame this family in front of God and everyone we know?" My mother's hands shook as she pointed at Ophalie. "You were my daughter," she said, her voice breaking, "but you are no longer welcome in my house." Guests began to leave, some consoling me, others too horrified to stay. I stood still, in the center of the storm, serene in victory. I didn't have to shout. I only had to show them who they really were. Inside me, triumph burned quietly, mixed with weariness. This wasn't the end. There would be healing, choices to make, life to rebuild. But this moment, this unmasking, was mine. They thought this wedding would be my prison. Instead, it became their courtroom. The church had gone eerily quiet after the storm of revelations. The projector was dark, the DNA reports lay scattered on the altar, and the echo of Ophalie's shrill denials still clung to the rafters. Guests sat frozen in their pews, some leaning into one another whispering, others staring straight ahead, unwilling to look at me, Damien, or my sister. My father stood stiff, his hands clenched at his sides, the fury on his face aimed squarely at Damien. My mother shook her head at Ophalie, tears tracking down her cheeks as though mourning a daughter she could no longer claim. A few relatives approached me quietly, offering gentle touches on my arm or whispered words of sympathy. But even with their support, exhaustion weighed on me. Winning, I realized, carried its own cost. I steadied myself, remembering something I had once read. Sometimes you win not by getting what you wanted, but by refusing to settle for less. And I had finally refused. I turned slowly toward Damien, his eyes darting away from mine. My hands moved with deliberate care as I reached for the rings, engagement and wedding both, the symbols I had once believed bound us together. The sanctuary was so still that I could hear my own breath as I pulled them free. For a moment I held them in my palm, heavy with the weight of lies they represented. Then, without hesitation, I let them fall. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed across the church, sharp, final. Gasps broke the silence. Every eye was on me. "Marrying you," I said to Damien, my voice steady though my chest burned, "would have been my biggest mistake." He opened his mouth, stammering, "Audrey, please, I can explain." But the silence that followed my words swallowed his. Guests turned to him with contempt, some shaking their heads, others murmuring in approval at my stand. I had not just ended a wedding. I had ended years of manipulation, lies, and the slow erosion of who I was. I felt the strange mix of grief and release, bitter and freeing all at once. This wasn't the ending I had dreamed of, but it was the ending I needed. I lifted my chin and stepped forward. My heels clicked against the stone floor as I walked down the aisle alone, not with a father on my arm, not with vows waiting at the altar, alone, but strong. The guests rose as I passed, some clapped softly, Others bowed their heads in respect. A few remained stiff, too shocked to react, but none could look away. It wasn't the wedding march I had imagined as a child. There was no music, no veil trailing behind me, but every step sounded like freedom. When the heavy doors opened, Charleston air rushed in, cool and sharp. The scent of magnolia carried on the breeze, and for the first time that day, I filled my lungs fully. Outside, the sky seemed wider. I had lost a fiancé and a sister, yes, but I had gained something far greater: clarity, independence. The knowledge that I would no longer let anyone write my story for me. I thought, sometimes family isn't who shares your blood, it's who stands with you when the world tries to break you. And in that moment, I knew the difference. The church faded behind me, its chaos muffled as the doors shut. My hands no longer shook. My stride was steady, my heart lighter than it had been in years. I whispered a line to myself as if to seal it in my bones. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Eleanor Roosevelt's words had been my grandmother's favorite, and now they belonged to me, too. I didn't need to know what tomorrow would bring. Career, friendships, maybe even love again one day. All that mattered was that it would be on my terms, not borrowed from someone else's shadow. I glanced back once at the church, its stained glass catching the late sun. A place that should have been the setting of vows had instead become the stage of unmasking. But I walked away with something vows could never give me: myself. I didn't walk out of that church as a wife. I walked out as a woman who finally chose herself. The church felt different once I had walked away from the altar. It no longer held me in its grip. The walls that moments earlier had witnessed humiliation and betrayal now echoed with the murmurs of shifting loyalty. Guests were filtering out in groups, voices rising in disbelief and anger. Some shook their heads, muttering about shame and scandal. Others glanced at me with something new in their eyes, not pity, not suspicion, but respect. I saw my father place his arm protectively around my mother as they approached me. His face was still red with fury, but none of it directed at me anymore. My mother, tears streaking her cheeks, whispered, "We should have seen it. We should have trusted you." For the first time in years, I felt them standing with me instead of against me. The atmosphere remained chaotic, yet inside I was calm. I had nothing left to prove. Revenge is not about anger. It's about balance being restored. Balance had finally begun to shift back into place. The fallout spread quickly. By evening, Damien's phone was buzzing endlessly, not with congratulations, but with clients backing out, colleagues distancing themselves. In Charleston, betrayal wasn't just a personal failing, it was a business liability. No one wanted to be tied to a man who stole from his own fiancée, let alone paraded around a scandal with her sister. Ophelie fared no better. Within days, the friends who had once crowded her social media pages with compliments fell silent. Messages went unanswered. Invitations were rescinded. Even family members who had always excused her sharp tongue and competitive nature now avoided her. I overheard one cousin whisper, "I can't believe she would stoop this low," while another said, "She burned every bridge she ever had." The financial fallout was just as swift. The bank records I had shown at the altar revealed more than betrayal. They revealed theft. Funds meant for the wedding had vanished into their joint account. There was talk of legal action, quiet discussions about fraud and embezzlement. For once, I didn't have to lift another finger. The truth did all the work. And as I watched the storm consume them, I thought, justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears the eyes of everyone who finally sees the truth. I saw them again briefly outside the church. Damien stood pale, wringing his hands, while Ophelie's face was streaked with mascara, her shoulders shaking with rage she tried to disguise as composure. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let anger color my words. I looked at my sister first. You wanted my life, I said evenly. Now you don't even have yours. She flinched as if struck. Then I turned to Damien. You were my almost husband. Now you're just a warning story. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. There were no excuses left, no lies strong enough to stand. I walked past them without another glance. On the steps of the church, I paused only long enough to set down the keys to the reception hall and the bouquet still in my hand. Both belonged to a day that no longer had meaning for me. They took my wedding, I whispered to myself, but I took back my future. And with that, I walked on, the sound of my heels steady, unshaken. Days later, life resumed its shape. I returned to work at the hospital, surrounded by colleagues who had heard whispers of what happened and treated me with quiet admiration. Leora visited often, her presence steady, reminding me that true family isn't about blood, but about those who choose to stand by you. My parents, once so quick to compare me to Ophelia, looked at me now with pride, seeing me not as the baby, but as a woman who had stood her ground when it mattered most. I thought about everything I had lost: an engagement, the sister I once believed would stand beside me for life. But what I had gained far outweighed the grief. I had clarity, independence, and strength that no betrayal could take away. As I wrote in my journal one quiet evening, I remembered the words of Carl Jung. I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who I wanted to be. That day was never my wedding. It was my rebirth. And I walked into the world not as a wife, but as a woman unbroken, unafraid, and free.